And now, the survival show that once survived, discussing lining up pregnancies with 3 different cultures' zodiac signs. In this episode, we sit down with CA Rudolph to discuss his book, What's Left of My World. We'll examine his story of a daughter's survival in a harsh world. Howdy and welcome to In the Rabbit Hole's Urban Survival Podcast. This is episode number 222. I'm your host, Aaron, and you are in the rabbit hole, safe and sound. Chad, welcome to In the Rabbit Hole.
Aaron, thank you very much for having me, sir. Appreciate it.
Yeah, definitely. This is going to be fun. We get one of my favorite episodes to do because we get to talk to interesting authors and hear about interesting books. And prepper fiction it's pretty much everybody's crack around here. So this is going to be fun. You are the author of What's Left of My World. But of course, before we get into that, before we get into the book, let's get to know you a little bit better. Are you a full-time author or do you have a day job?
I wish so much that I could be a full-time author. I'm almost certain that just about everybody in my position wishes the same thing.
Yeah.
I do have a day job.
Okay.
I'm what they call, what my industry calls an engineering specialist. So I'm a combination of a design engineer and a programmer, and I work for a controls company in Northern Virginia. And we design control systems that surround heating and air conditioning for very large commercial buildings. So it takes up a lot of my time.
I bet.
So the very limited amount of spare time I have, that's when I actually do the whole author thing.
Mm-hmm. So how did you end up getting into preparedness? Is it a thing you've just been in your whole life, or is it something you came to because of an event, or how'd that start?
The mindset I've had my entire life, and it's kind of hard to explain. I mean, without going into a lot of detail, but I'll try to paraphrase. I grew up in a very rural area. In fact, my grandparents owned a large cattle farm, and we had a portion where I lived on it, and then we had another portion where my aunt, uncle, and my cousins lived on it. But all of us lived on this same portion of land in this rural area in Frederick County, Virginia. And we were always outside. Back then, there was nothing else to do except just go outside. And 11 or 12 years old, when we would leave the house, we would just always take a gun with us. We would always take a 22, or they'd even got to a point one time where we would take a small shotgun or something with us because we never knew what we were going to encounter when we were walking around in the fields or in the woods. It was just always a mindset. As I got older, my dad, he liked to buy a lot of magazines, and he liked to buy like the Soldier of Fortune magazine.
Oh yeah.
He's real big into Survival magazine and Soldier of Fortune. Those weren't the only magazines he bought, but those are the ones that he allowed me to look at. And I would look at them and read some of the articles, but what really caught my attention was the stuff that was in the back of them. And those were where they would sell the bunkers, and they would sell the food storage, and these piles and piles of buckets, and they would just sell you all these years worth of food. And I'm like, well, what's that all about? And it was because of this thing. This thing called, when the shit hits the fan. Yeah. What's that all about? And I just started doing more and more research over the years. What really got me into it was, things happening around the country and, seeing how unstable society was. I became a ham radio operator. It happened because I started watching like crazy things happening with the weather and started seeing severe thunderstorms. And we had what really did it was there was an F4 tornado that hit La Plata, Maryland. It was a long time ago. I think it was 2002. And that's what caught my attention and made me want to get prepared and start thinking a little bit differently, than what I used to, kind of haphazard. And when I got my license, I started running into other hams, and they were all very like-minded. They're all very big into guns for the most part. And they're all very big into survivalism and preparedness and prepping. And I really didn't realize it until after I got into it. They were all that way. Plus, I'm a backpacker. And when you go backpacking, you spend a lot of time depriving yourself of things that you would normally have. And it puts you into a different mindset. If you go backpacking and you forget something that you desperately need, it'll be the absolute last time you ever forget it again.
Yes. Yeah.
So,
well, cool. So as far as the writing goes, how did you come to that? Is that a similar thing where you started off early in childhood writing a little bit and then came back to it? Or is this something you were inspired more later in life?
I started writing when I was in my mid-teens, and I'll never forget it. My dad had purchased an Apple compatible computer from some weird television auction site. And we had a computer and we had word processing software, back on the old 5.25 floppy disks and whatnot. And, no way to save our work other than to save it on another 5.25, which all it takes is just the sun to hit it for 5 minutes to destroy all your work, or a magnet.
Mm-hmm.
And I started writing stories, just little short stories. I think one of the things that inspired me to write a long time ago were the LA riots. And I just started writing stories based upon, similar situations that I saw on television when that was going on. And as I got older, I moved into high school and started reading books and doing book reports and learning how to write in prose. And that's when I got turned on to books like On the Beach by Neville Shute and 1984 by George Orwell.
Mm-hmm.
And those books caught my attention like anything else I'd ever read. Reading books and reading how other authors write their prose was what really cued me in on how to write my own. But that's really what started with me. I started writing a short story about 14 years ago called Fall of the Indomitable. It was about how America itself had fallen. It was very Red Dawn-esque.
Mm.
Red Dawn was a huge movie for a Gen Xer.
Yeah.
And it was about a boy who his family had been living in the middle of nowhere for God knows how long. Really didn't go into how much, was why this happened. It ended up being a 5,000 word short story before I knew it. And that short story actually ended up becoming a part of What's Left of My World. So,
that's pretty interesting. That's a long time in the making then. You mentioned George Orwell. Who are the authors that inspire you?
The authors that inspire me today, and it's funny because I've gone through stages in my life where I've been interested, and then I've kind of swayed away and gotten interested in other things. But I guess a few years ago, and if you've read my book, you've read the preface where I explained, where I started spending a lot more time on the road, and in doing so, I started listening to audiobooks because I was tired of listening to the news, and it just gets old. And and a friend of mine told me, he turned me on to this article, and I was reading this article about electromagnetic pulses, and I was reading it and I was like, oh my gosh, what the heck is an electromagnetic pulse? And the more I read about it, the more it intrigued me. But the article mentioned William Forstchen's book, 1 Second After.
Mm-hmm.
I downloaded it and listened to it as an audiobook, and I was fixated on it from the first word to the very end. It just owned me. And if anybody who has listened to it or read it, there's a part in that book that really gripped me, and it has a lot to do with the main character and his daughter. And I myself have 2 daughters, and right then and there, I was immediately. I was gripped. I had to do something. I had to write, and I had a story that needed to come out from my point of view. But after that, it just snowballed. I mean, post-apoc is just an amazing genre.
Yes.
I started listening to a lot of Chris Weatherman's stuff, Angry American, and of course Franklin Horton. All of Glenn Tate's books. I've listened to all of Franklin Horton's books, and Franklin he's a colleague, he's a friend, and he was the one guy that when I had all the questions I had about becoming a self-published author myself, he had all the answers, and he's still that guy. He's also a fellow Virginian. But those are the guys primarily, I guess. There's so many out there now. Every time I get my Audible credit, I have a really hard time deciding who I'm going to listen to next.
Yeah. I share that affliction. I definitely do. We'll be back after this quick break. Things are pretty quiet in the gun community right now. There's no crazy laws coming out or big new calls for gun control. And gun owners like myself are feeling pretty safe and pretty good about things right now. Pretty optimistic. But you never know when the next gun-grabbing bonanza is going to start driving prices sky high and inventories crazy low because every Tom, Dick, and Harry decides that's the moment they need a gun, right? Now, we're really big on skills over gear around here, but sometimes pieces of gear just can't be beaten. And that's where a gun fits into your preparedness plans. This usually brings up where to get the best deal with the least BS, because gun buying can be just a headache. You should try martinarmory.com. They were founded with a simple goal: to make buying a gun simple and affordable. And instead of carrying thousands of different guns, they only carry 25. This is kind of crazy, but it allows them to focus on providing the most popular guns on the market at the very lowest prices. Now, for a limited time, ITRH listeners get a little something extra. You get free shipping. Simply go to martinarmory.com, pick out a gun, and enter the promo code RABBITHOLE at checkout. Again, that's martinarmory.com. Enter the promo code RABBITHOLE at checkout. Listener, do you get at least $3 a month worth of value out of ITRH? You should see what we do for the Roving Horde Armada members. Check it out today by visiting ITRH.net. Members get access to episodes a day early, access to monthly virtual and in-person meetups in some areas, an invitation to the secret ITRH Armada Facebook group so you can chat about survival all day long with like-minded people, access to every episode ever produced by ITRH. That's right, all the way back to the beginning, including one that was never aired. And those are just a few things you get with your membership when you sign up and become part of the ITRH Roving Horde by going to ITRH.net. Again, that's ITRH.net. So what about non-prepper books?
You know, when I was really young, the very first book I ever actually read was Stephen King's The Shining. And I read Firestarter and I read Carrie, and it was just, his writing was, I was always really intrigued by superhero fiction. And a lot of the stuff that he does is not just horror, but it has a lot to do with superhero fiction and that stuff. I was very intrigued by him.
Very cool. So now you mentioned that you had this short story that ended up kind of weaving into your current book, which is What's Left of My World. Is that what was the inspiration, or were you just using that as sort of a base to a soup? I mean, how did What's Left of My World come to be?
So What's Left of My World came out. It was just a story that I wanted to tell. And I used that short story as a base, but I didn't want to start the book out with that short story. I wanted to go a little bit further before. But basically the whole premise was the same, with the exception that I used different characters. I wanted it to be from my point of view as a father who cares about his family. And if something ever were to happen and I wasn't around, you know, what would I do to make sure that they were going to be okay in my absence? And it's a shame because, you know, the father's character in the book really doesn't have an active a spot in the book except in the flashbacks. He's mentioned a lot, but for the most part, what he did, you know, for his daughter and what he did for his family before all this happened, you know, that's the reason, one of the reasons at least, why they're all still alive and thriving today.
So that's pretty interesting. Is it, now when you write, do you write just to write and survival lessons fall in there? Or are you writing with the specific intention of trying to incorporate as many survival lessons as you can?
I don't really consider myself as much of a prepper as I do a survivalist or an outdoorsman with like survivalist tendencies. But I have a huge affinity for self-preservation. And I think it's a primal instinct. And when it comes down to you or me, it's going to be me. And I think that's one of the things I just always want to try to stress is the world is always going to be full of bad people. I mean, we're never going to be able to get rid of them.
Right.
And, you know, in order to survive and preserve our way of life, we're going to have to do some nasty things if it ever comes down to it. But when I sit down and write, it just kind of flows. I don't really decide a lesson is going to be learned until after I've reread it 5, 10, 20 times. And I'm like, I can probably fit this in here now. But for the most part, I just start and I just let it flow. And then I think almost every author probably does the same thing, where the very first thing that they put out is crap. And then they come back 20 times, and then finally they finally think it's okay.
Yeah. The author I used to work for, actually the first author that I worked for, and probably one of the most famous authors that I worked for, used to tell me, he said, it's never about the words that you vomit on the page. It's always the words that you take off the page that make a piece of writing really good. And then it's just a matter of going over it like hundreds of times and to the point where you're sick of it. So yeah, I totally understand what you mean by that. That makes sense. So we've hinted and teased at it. Walk us into your books. How does it start, and tell us about the characters? And, you also talked about your daughters a little bit. So let us have it. Like, give us the spiel here. What is this book?
I will say that, I decided to write What's Left of My World and use my youngest daughter as the primary character's focus. I use her personality because she's not as old as the character in the book, but she's going to be someday.
Yeah.
But she's got a fire inside of her like I've never seen before. She's 9 years old now, and she's absolutely just incredible. I've been able to hold adult conversations with her since she was like, I don't know, 2.5 years old. Incredibly intelligent. She picks up on things. You teach her something one time and she never forgets it. She has an incredible memory. She has an eidetic memory. I mean, she can recall images and it's almost like she can replay a video in her mind if she wanted to.
Wow.
But Lauren's character in the book, the main character is Lauren Russell. She's basically my youngest daughter, and she has the same character traits, the same character flaws. She's very assertive. She's very curious. She's very adventurous. But she's also a little badass. She's been taught these skills. Her dad made sure that she was going to be ready for that day if that day were to ever come. But the problem is she's been taught. We all know you can go to training all day long, but until that day actually happens, how you're going to react to the scenario, you don't really know. And in the first book, and What's Left of My World, she doesn't really know how she's going to react until things start happening, and then it starts coming to her, and it becomes instinctive. But it doesn't mean that she doesn't need help. She's young, she's 18. Lauren's character is 18 in the book, and she makes mistakes. But she's also got a supportive family, and she's got a community that everybody helps each other out. And that's one of the reasons why they're able to survive and thrive like they can. Which honestly, I think is going to be, if something like that were to happen in the real world, I think that it would be very hard to find a community like them that would get along the way that they do in the book. But that's why I like fiction. You can bend the rules a little bit, in order to suit the story. But What's Left of My World takes the enemies, takes the bad guys to the extreme a little bit, and I think it's necessary because it makes us think. There's no limitation whatsoever to the depravity of man, and we have to be ready for that day. I tell everybody that one of the things I've always say is it's only fiction because it hasn't happened yet. So the one day that it does happen and becomes nonfiction, I won't be able to cash in on it.
Yeah. Hasn't happened here yet, but it has happened in places before. So
exactly. Yeah.
There you go. That's pretty interesting. And I think there's lots going on here. So what do you feel is the big takeaway from your book that you want readers to get out of it, other than just a really good story?
Anything is possible. I think it's very important that we consider everything every day. Don't take anything for granted. Consider that nothing in the world matters more than family. And you also need to involve your family in everything that you do as much as you're involved. Society is very fragile. I mean, we've seen it, like you just said. I mean, it happens everywhere else but here. Well, it's only a matter of time. And now we're starting to see things. We're starting to see things in our own country that are a harbinger for it to happen here. We live in a very uncertain world, very uncertain times, and the human race is the most unpredictable species. That's the reason why we prep. I mean, if anything, we prep not just for the events, but we prep, for the way we think people will perceive and react to them.
Mm-hmm.
And that's a huge undertaking.
Yes.
It's
Yes,
almost
it is.
impossible to encapsulate it.
Yeah.
Like, where do you start? Where do you begin when
Yeah.
you try to come up with every conceivable scenario?
Mm-hmm.
But that's pretty much what it is. It's just it's to provoke thought. It's to get it's to get the reader to think, a little bit differently than what we normally would when you get up, get dressed, and go to work every day.
Yeah. That raises an interesting question. You spent so much time in the book staring into the abyss. How did it impact and influence the way you prepare? Or did it? Did you come out the other side of writing this book the same prepper survivalist that went into it, or were there things that changed for you afterwards?
It's funny because I'll go back and I'll read what I wrote. Sometimes I'll say to myself, I don't even remember reading. I don't even remember writing that. But for the most part, for me, it's not what I write that changes the way that I think or the way that I prep. It's what I read from other authors.
Okay.
And honestly, I get some ideas, but I branch off. I try my best to not steal ideas. It's a really big no-no in this business. But I do get very much. I get a lot of encouragement, a lot of. I guess what I'm trying to say is, as far as my writing is concerned, it doesn't really change the way that I think or prep. I'm pretty much the same person every day.
Mm-hmm.
Ever since this whole thing started for me, and I started listening to and reading post-apoc, and I started this whole lifestyle, it's made me very aware. And I'm really big into people watching. And you just never know when something is going to happen.
Yeah, and I think that raises an interesting thing with your day job and everything else. And I think going back to what you were talking about, starting with Forsham's book and the EMP, I imagine that had to be pretty interesting considering your intimate awareness of how much of the world is becoming automated and run by computer systems and everything else, and how disconnected most people have become from the world around them and almost unable to interact with the world around them without their smartphone or without their different automations.
Oh, we're becoming more and more dependent on technology every single day. I mean, we are our society, this society. I mean, our generation, the generation past us, the generation just before us. I mean, if something like that were to happen today, I wouldn't even want to think. I mean, I have to because I write about it.
Right.
But I mean, my great grandparents, if it happened in their era, they wouldn't care.
Mm-hmm.
They would wake up the next day and they would, if they were hungry, they'd go out and cut the head off of a chicken and pluck the feathers out and cook it just like they always used to. They wouldn't even notice. But people like us, who have our faces stuck in our cell phones all the time, and it would change everything.
Yeah.
And like what you were saying is very true, because I travel so far from home. I'm anywhere from 60 miles to 100 miles away from home any given point of the day.
Mm-hmm.
I could be in downtown DC, Northern Virginia, places in Maryland, so on and so forth. And when I think about what I've read in other books, in a situation like that, running out of gas or an EMP striking and having to hoof it home, it totally changed the way that I prepped back then. Because now I carry so much stuff with me.
Yeah, it used to drive me nuts when I had to travel a lot for work, and I would end up in North Carolina a lot, and also for quite a while I would end up in Los Angeles a lot, and just trying to figure out. It was like every time I would get ready to get on a plane, I would start thinking about how long it would take me to walk back home, and what would be the things that would stand in the way, and how would I actually get my hands on what I needed to get home. And it used to just drive me nuts. Yeah.
And the whole get home bag thing is a huge inspiration, because I carry one every day.
Mm-hmm.
And I reassess what's in it. And one of the first, I actually wanted to test it one day, and I got out and, was getting ready to start walking, and I realized I did not bring the right shoes for this.
Yeah.
So that was another odd thing. You have to be able to have the most comfortable footwear you can possibly hoof it in, because you don't know how long you're going to be on your feet. There's a lot of considerations.
Mm-hmm.
It's like I said earlier, it's almost impossible to encapsulate them all.
Yes, that is very true. And also why I leave an extra pair of tennis shoes under a bag, hidden under a back seat along with my bag. But and I think that that kind of leads us into prep. What is your prepper pet peeve? What gets floated around the community, or just dumb things that people say that drives you nuts, that you wish you would just want to smack people when you hear it?
I want to smack people for a lot of things. I'd try to stay out of jail. No,
that's generally a good rule.
My biggest pet peeve would be the fact, and there's a reason. I used to follow a lot of survivalist and prepper groups on Facebook, and I used to do the survivalist and prepper forum things, and it's such a waste of time. My biggest peeve is the fact that nobody can ever agree on anything.
Yeah.
There are so many experts out there. Everybody is an expert, and their opinion is always the right one. And it's bickering. And if somebody asks a question, there's 1,000 answers to somebody's question. And then you get two guys that want to argue over the most insipid, tiny little detail. And in the meantime, there's a person out there that wants information, and they're not getting it.
Mm-hmm.
And they have to pick and choose, kind of weed through who's right and who's wrong. Well, nobody's right and nobody's wrong. Everybody feels differently. I think the biggest thing is there's a hierarchy in prepping. And I think that the most important thing is to prep according to what can kill you first, depending on the circumstances.
Mm-hmm.
But it doesn't really matter what I think, because I'm not an expert, and I'll be the first one to tell you that I'm not.
Yeah.
If I was an expert, I would have written a book called CA Rudolph Prepping Expert, but I didn't write that.
Yeah.
So, that's my biggest pet peeve. I mean, as far as prepper books are concerned, my biggest peeve would be books that are written that aren't realistic. Just books that are written where they don't really focus a whole lot on guns and firearms. And I hate to be the bearer of bad news, but it's a major topic.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
I've heard people argue and say that there's no point in even thinking about guns because ammunition's finite. And I'm like, well, the other guy is thinking about it.
Yeah.
He's got ammunition. And if you are just going to not even going to deal with the notion, he's going to have guns and ammo and you're not, who's going to win?
Yeah.
And that's another, there's a lot of books that are out there that are like that, that just aren't realistic to me. But aside, that's my biggest thing. Is just people just are people. They just can't agree on anything. And instead of just being helpful, it tends to be the exact opposite.
Right.
Especially for those who don't know anything about prepping and are trying to get into it.
Yeah.
It's very difficult to broach the topic with people.
Mm-hmm. Very true. And I'm glad you brought up guns. That brings up one of my favorite questions. Which is your long gun? Of course, are you an AK, an AR, shotgun, or something more exotic kind of guy?
I would never go exotic because they're not prevalent enough. I'm a fan of the AR and the AK.
Mm-hmm.
I will say one thing: I'm a bigger fan of the AK, and this is the biggest reason why. I'm left-handed.
Okay.
So if you've ever operated an AK as a left-hander, it is a wonderful, beautiful thing. It's almost like it was made for left-handed people.
Mm-hmm.
But it's also a very simple weapon, and it's probably the same reason why I prefer Glock handguns.
Mm-hmm.
It's a tool, and it does what it's supposed to do. If it ever came down to it, and I had to pick one gun, it would be a .22 long rifle. It would be one of my older .22 long rifles, honestly, and I'll probably get a lot of people saying you're crazy, but I know what it does. I know it's accurate. I have plenty of ammunition for it.
Mm-hmm.
But that would probably be my absolute go-to. Would be a good old trusty .22.
I gotcha. That's a pretty good one. What would you say is your most important piece of gear? Your one thing?
Oh gosh, my brain.
That's a good one.
Is that even a legitimate answer?
That's a legitimate answer. We'll take that. You're the first one to use that, so you get to have it. So that
the fact that I can think and problem solve, I would say that's probably my best piece of gear.
That's a good piece of gear. That's good one. Good one. I like that. So what would you say is the best $100 you've ever spent in prep?
When I listened to the other podcasts, I actually prepared myself for this, and this is the God's honest truth. When I started getting my daughter involved in prepping and backpacking and survivalist type gear, that was the best $100 I ever spent. Because the look on her face when I handed her a water filter for the first time. She was just like, well, what do we do with it? And then I showed her how to use it. And now she carries it everywhere she goes.
Oh, very cool.
Bought her a first aid kit and a trauma kit. And the very first time I got her a Swiss Army knife.
Mm-hmm.
It was just the most amazing. It was like I could have bought her a diamond ring and she wouldn't have liked it as much.
Oh, wow. That's awesome.
Yeah. So now she's 9 years old. She has her own bug out bag. She has a go bag that she takes everywhere we go. That was probably, I don't know, it was probably around $100, maybe 101.
Mm-hmm.
that was the best money I spent, best $100 I know for a fact. Because it's so important to get them involved. If you turn it into an individual thing, it becomes a hobby and they feel left out. But as soon as you start, especially the children, especially when they're young, you get them involved now and they'll start out with that mindset.
Mm-hmm.
And that's definitely the best $100 I ever spent.
Awesome, man. All right, man. So somebody goes out and they pick up your book, What's Left of My World, and they decide this guy is my brand of crazy. How do they connect with you? How do they keep up with you and find out what's up next?
Well, assuming they make it all the way to the end, there's going to be some links in the back. And among those links are going to be the links to my website. That's where they're going to find all the crazy stuff. My website is www.carudolph.com. CARudolph.com.
One more time. Give us the website address.
CARudolph.com.
Awesome. And I guess from there, they can connect with you on Facebook too. I'm sure you've got a link there and
sure.
And follow you and see memes and baby pictures and all kinds of stuff. Yeah, that's
all I post is memes and baby pictures.
Exactly.
And babies with guns.
Well, yeah. And kittens with guns. Don't forget kittens with guns.
As long as they have guns.
Well, yeah.
Facebook and Twitter and Instagram, I'm pretty active on all that stuff whenever I'm not actually writing. Yeah, so all the links are there.
Cool. So what's up next? I mean, you've got that first book out. Are you going to give us another one? What's the story?
Oh, sure. Yeah. Not too long ago, just released book number 2, entitled This We Will Defend. It picks up pretty much where the last book left off. Continuing story of a family's survival is the subtitle. It's got a lot of really good stuff in it. This book flowed a lot easier than the first book did. It was a lot of fun to write. It's a lot longer than the first book. It's out everywhere and it's doing really well, and really, really proud to share it with everyone.
Awesome,
so
man.
That's my present plans, and we're just going to keep on moving forward with the series.
Very cool. Very cool. Well, dude, thank you for being on today, and I look forward to checking out your next book.
Great, man. Aaron, thank you very much for having me.
Show notes, links, and resources to author CA Rudolph can be found at intherabbithole.com/E222. That's 222. Support the show and get more survival goodness. Become a member of the ITRH Roving Horde Armada. Visit ITRH.net. Again, that's ITRH.net. Get free shipping on your next gun purchase. Go to martinarmory.com and use the promo code RABBITHOLE at checkout. Again, that's martinarmory.com. From the Lone Star State. Till next time, stay safe and sound.